Hello, welcome back to the Rippling Pages podcast. Today I'm with Soraya Palmer, and she's here to talk to me about the human origins of Beatrice Porter and other essential ghosts. Ultimately, this is a novel about stories. Sasha and Zora, young girls growing up in Brooklyn, listen to their mothers and fathers' stories about old Higue, a mystic who flies through the sky like a fireball and sucks your blood. Or listen to the stories about Anansi, a spider, a weaver of stories described as a god who exists to make a scene. But it's in these stories that truths lie. Truths about relationships, truths about history, truths about traumatic pasts. A novel described by the New York Times as a book written with the gods of storytelling in mind. It highlights what stories can do, that it's not just the stories that evolve with each telling, but we ourselves who are rearranged too. Elsewhere, Soraya advocates for survivors of gender-based violence who are facing criminal charges related to their abuse. I'm very excited to say Soraya joins me from Brooklyn to tell us more. Soraya, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Really excited to talk to you today. And what we'll do, we'll get straight into it. Because as I've just alluded to there, this is a novel full of stories. Which story came first to you in the writing of the novel?
The first one actually is chapter 1. That I actually had a version of it that I wrote in undergrad. So a long time ago. And at that time, I didn't know I was writing a novel. I was just writing about a family that liked to tell stories. And I liked the idea of like stories within stories and how the family used folklore to kind of approach conflict. And I was also just very interested in like food, which I don't know if it ended up being as major of a theme by the end, because the second one I wrote is now chapter 5 in the restaurant. So I think in the beginning there was like a big food theme going about like food is very important in the Caribbean, as are stories. And I just liked the idea of them using the food and the stories to show love and to try to explain the unexplainable. And
Yeah, so you started at the start. Well, the novel is centered around a family, and the first scene is when they go into the supermarket to buy groceries. So not necessarily having a meal themselves, but they're buying groceries. And I thought it was a really interesting introduction to this family. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit more about the family before we go into that scene, maybe.
I think that I was interested in having like a Caribbean American family in Brooklyn. I grew up in Brooklyn. And then my mom is Trinidadian and my dad is Jamaican, and they both love stories. Um, and so I think I brought that into it for sure. And yeah, and I also have a close relationship with my siblings. And I kind of wanted that, especially like the sister relationship, I think is particularly interesting to me. Um, and I just wanted that to be central, just like how your sister can be your best friend, and the complexities of like mother-daughter relationships, especially with Sasha and her mom.
Yeah, the sister's the focal point to the novel, really.
Mhm.
Um, and I have a sister too, and it made me think about sort of my relationship with her. And but what I find interesting is how you write the voices of both the sisters. You're not exclusively in one mind. Did that come naturally, or was that a difficult thing to do, or does that say something about the closeness of these two sisters?
So like originally when I was just writing stories, I think, and they were all just sort of separate characters, but that were sort of similar. So then when I kind of combined them into one book, it kind of created two distinct characters. Because like they have a lot of similarities, but also some like, apparent differences. And so I think I took the things that, I don't know, the things that maybe could have been contradictory if it was just one character, and kind of made it two different characters, if that makes sense. The fact that Zora is very optimistic, and like her love for writing, her kind of wanting to believe the best in like her dad and like in everybody, that things will work out. Um, and Sasha being a little bit more jaded about things. and guarded. Like I feel like those are things that I relate to both those ways of thinking and feeling. And so I think it was not difficult to sort of put myself in those minds, because I think that they're both kind of relatable to me.
They are different, but they are. I don't know. I don't think this is a thing about siblings anyway. You know, it's a strange thing. Like you can be incredibly different, but you ultimately you are from the same, from the same blood. You have the same inherit, from the same parents. And this, I think that's what the real appeal is in this book, and it is so centered around the family, even though it sort of refracts and goes into lots of different narratives. I don't know if you found that. If the appeal of having, they could have, if there were two friends, you wouldn't be able to sort of play on the same dynamics, maybe.
Like there's things about their relationship that could be like a best friendship that changes over time, but I think it's different when you have the same parents, because like, I think part of them growing apart was at times like Sasha seeing how Zora gets treated differently, by the dad. Or like Zora not wanting to admit that the dad's having an affair, or like, things like that, I think are things that kind of drove them apart as sisters that might not have necessarily happened if they were just friends with two different families.
It's a very bittersweet novel. It's really kind of sad moment. Well, there's lots of very sad moments, but in terms of the kind of relationships between the sister, particularly the mother, there's some really real tinge to the nicer moments have together. There is a kind of sort of sad sort of edge to it. I mean, I guess, well, to go back to that first scene, because it introduces some of the ideas that do play throughout the novel, and it just felt like a bit of an encapsulation of some of the dynamics that are going on here within the family. And it introduced to sort of particularly it's an early scene for the father. At that point in writing this, and just because you said you sort of started with this at the start, did you kind of see the trajectory of the father going into kind of violence that he did, that we find out about?
Yes, in the first chapter, yeah, I knew that it was kind of going to erupt. I think that I tried to show, like, I mean, I've heard some people say Nigel's like the villain, and I don't think of him that way. I really wanted to show just like all the different parts of him. The ways that he's hurting, because of feeling not man enough for his dad, and like what happened with his brother. Not being able to open up, and the way that, he can take things out on people, just like his own warped views about masculinity and how they like affect his family. But also how it affects him and gives him like a smaller life. Those different ideas for him, and just we're just trying to find ways to show them all throughout the book. And so it's not just like he's violent, he's, a womanizer or whatever.
Yeah, it's a difficult read at times in terms of Father Nigel, because you present those different aspects to him, because you see him in these moments where he's been violent and abusive, but there is these other aspects to his narrative that you bring in, and obviously go back in time as well, which we'll come to in a moment. But so they're buying groceries, and it turns out that they don't have enough money to pay for the groceries, and it leads him to telling his story about the rolling calf. And at that point in the novel, we're not really kind of aware of the sort of significance of the father telling the story. It kind of seems like a bit of a distraction away from. And then they get home, and then the sisters, Zora and Sasha, they start telling their own stories to one another. But they're doing it in the backdrop of the mother and father having an argument.
I mean, there's different variations, but the way like my dad used to tell it to me was, and the way I write about it is that it's somebody that gets almost condemned to be a rolling calf because of being a butcher in life. And it's looks like a bull, and it has like breathes fire, and it has like a rattling chain for a tail. And it's usually told as like a type of ghost story. And it's also not only like as a ghost story, but like I guess maybe like an urban legend, because it's usually like, oh, I knew somebody that this happened to or something, where, you know, they're walking home and like, you know, or like my aunt said that she saw, like she heard the chains and, you know, she saw some fire and then like ran away, or, you know, things like that.
And these are real stories from Caribbean folklore. Is it specifically Trinidadian?
The rolling calf is more Jamaican. There, so it's kind of a mix of both. Anansi is in both, and of course, there's also Anansi stories in West Africa too. But then there's some like Old Higue is Jamaican, but then in Trinidad there's the Sukuyant, which is kind of the same thing. They just have different names. Same with Mama Glow is in
Yeah.
Trinidad, but there's also like River Muma.
What I found interesting is that another way that the sisters Sasha and Zora distract themselves is by watching horror films. Was it intentionally the purpose to put all of these in? Because they do pop up from time to time.
I was interested in the way like American pop culture played a role for them, and just thinking, so not just horror, but in thinking that they're this Caribbean family in Brooklyn, and it's all this like very white media. With the horror, I mean, some of it was like because of what was happening in the plot, like with The Exorcist. Well, that actually is somewhat based on a real story, where when I was younger and I watched The Exorcist, and we weren't supposed to watch The Exorcist, I think me and my sister. And
All right.
and then that night I did really feel like my room was possessed, because I would hear like the walls beating and like all these weird sounds, and like all this stuff was happening. And I like we didn't actually do an exorcism, or like we didn't do all of that, but I definitely stopped sleeping in my room, and we found out it was a bird's nest in the walls, or that's what they say.
All
That's what the
right.
adult said, was that it was a bird's nest. I'm still not convinced. So I that particular story, I think I just wanted to kind of recreate. In other ways, I think that it was just interesting to look at well, like I said, the pop culture, but also the way that violence plays such a role, and
Yeah. Yeah.
horror is like this entertainment, but it's also something that that it was happening to them, and that they're trying to navigate or like avoid thinking about. And I think it's kind of interesting to use horror to do that, because there's also horrors happening to you that you don't want to look at, but you're like choosing to look at these others for fun. How do kids understand violence, you know, and how do they try to explain it? And horror movies are very much like not really for kids, but kids often sneak in and watch them, and then have all these crazy like theories and paranoias and whatever.
I don't know if it, I don't know what you think about this. Do you think that there is a particular appeal in the violence of the horror film? Is that the kind of what the spectacle of it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's so many reasons people get drawn to horror in general, but that could be like a whole other podcast. But for the sisters, I think it was partly the violence, but also like it wasn't all like Buffy, for instance. I think for Zora was more of like a solve, like a comfort blanket in a way, like somebody that she just grew up with as like a hero. I mean, I have a like a complicated relationship with horror, where I can get very easily scared, but I've always been very fascinated by it, because I think that it can do such a good job of like commenting on society in ways that other genres can't necessarily. And they often are able to do like very weird stuff. Watching a horror movie as a choice can feel more like you're taking some control back because you're choosing to watch it and you're not scared, or you are scared, but you're like navigating through it or something.
Hey there, just a quick message from me. And just to say, if you're really enjoying today's podcast, I'd be really grateful if you left a review on your favourite podcast provider. The Rippling Pages is all about letting writers talk about their craft so that you and other listeners can learn more about the art of literature. Leaving a review increases the reach of the podcast and hopefully means that more people will hear about the writer's work. Thanks very much, and it's just great to have you here. Why did you choose to call it a ghost story?
Like I mentioned, like the rolling calf, I feel like is definitely told to be like a kind of urban legend type of ghost story. Of course, like others like Anansi is like a trickster story, not necessarily technically a ghost, but like a spirit. The difference between ghost and spirit and ancestor is kind of like sometimes a connotation, cultural connotation, that ghosts usually just have the connotation of being more scary, but like a spirit or an ancestor, maybe you can learn something from them. But I think really they could all be called ghosts. Our past history, historical traumas can also be like ghosts of our past as well. And so I think I was interested in the term in a more broader sense, not just like as a horror, but like all of the ways that we think about ghosts, like, Beloved, you could call that horror also, but I think it's also like similarly looking at the trauma of slavery, also as a different type of haunting. And I think that in a lot of Black ghost stories, you kind of see both the literal manifestations of spirits, but then also just all these other things that might be haunting the characters. My book, in terms of like thinking about what are all the things that are haunting these characters. So Nigel was haunted by the rolling calf, but also by his brother. And then Sasha also is haunted by the rolling calf as well. And Sasha also gets sort of guided by the spirit of Anansi, like the mother does. And then the mother also has the ghost of Anakwana. So I think like, there's just like these different times where these different ghosts will show up for them, but then also their pasts haunt them.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes it feels like you've alluded to, or like you said, sometimes it feels, actions that they've done, but also, yeah, more kind of generational haunting. Why is it those particular myths that are significant? Why is it those particular stories that are significant?
I mean, these were stories I grew up with. So they were really important to me that way. I think, a lot of the stories I think have origins in Africa. And so one of the things that is cool is that when I'm in the Caribbean, I think that I can feel this kind of closer link to my own ancestors. I think because they've been able to hold on to more through stories and through food and religion, music, like all these different things that I think were, I guess, harder in the States, probably also because slavery lasted longer. And we're also not the majority here. So I feel like that also makes it harder to hold on to that. Anansi in the Caribbean, which I think is different from Anansi in like Ghana and Nigeria. But in the Caribbean, Anansi stories were often like parallels for kind of overcoming your oppressors. And I think a lot of trickster stories can be sort of like that, where it's like, here is this little spider that you would think could never overpower, a lion or a tiger. And yet, it's able to use its kind of trickster ways, and wit and all of this stuff to gain the upper hand. It's not like, I think, unlike a lot of kind of Western fairy tales where there's often like one specific like moralistic lesson at the end. I think a lot of the stories can have different interpretations. Like Anansi is sometimes a hero and sometimes a villain and sometimes, none of the above. And I kind of like that it's just a little bit more, it's like a multiverse, I guess, of versions of Anansi, and like all of the characters really, like Mama Glow, I think, can be described as like a healer, but then also can be violent as well. To me, it makes sense that those are stories that would be created and like passed down in the Caribbean versus Germany, where like the Grimm fairy tales were, because of course you wouldn't necessarily have like easy ways of thinking about good or evil when like the things that you were taught were good by your colonizers were, full of contradictions because they're also colonizing you and taking all your resources and like whatever and telling you to go to church. And I think that it's harder to maybe come up with like a simple fairy tale. And this is not, I also love, Grimm fairy tales and Hans Christian Andersen too. But I think it just comes from a very different culture.
Instead of, it doesn't become necessarily, it does become about the story, but Anansi is alive. It's a live thing that changes and moves. It's not reliant on the story itself, if that makes sense. It's this thing that is kind of alive. We're introduced to the mother, Beatrice, obviously at the start, but what we do is we go back in time to learn more about Beatrice, and we see a lot of different sides to mother, and this really brings a very different aspect to her, different perspective to Beatrice. Some of the things that she enjoyed, some of how she brought some of the stories with her as well from the Caribbean. Why did you choose that particular aspect as the starting point? Well, it's not the literal starting point of the novel, but why did you go back to that as the starting point for the mother back into the 70s before she moved to America?
Well, I think for both of the parents, I kind of went back to their kind of coming of age story because I think that was such a big focus for the book. And like we spend so much time on that with Sasha and Zora. And so I kind of wanted to see how that developed for the parents. And for Beatrice, I think we needed to know more about her relationship with Sasha, because it seemed like they were always butting heads, and yet they have so much in common, and kind of looking to see, how that started for her and her own relationship with her mother, and and like her relationship with Love before Nigel. Like I think I wanted to see all of those things.
What I just find interesting is that it kind of, compared to the other characters, with Beatrice, we see her, it feels like we see sort of all her lives happening at once. So we see her when she's young, we see her when she's sort of, like I said, learning different kinds of love, and we see her when she's older, and what that brings. You used the word multiverse, didn't you? And it feels like that's kind of what's going on with the mother. I don't know if that's fair or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think, seeing her as a teenager, and then in that chapter, it like alludes a lot to her future, the things she wanted for her future, like the origin of the Anansi Stories book, and where she got it, and like kind of her love for stories, I think is connected to that as well. How she got her scars. And then we see her also when she first meets Nigel, her past gets alluded to later on with Sasha when they're telling the Anansi stories together, and she kind of lets Sasha in finally.
Is that what it feels like, I think, when she finally sort of lets her in?
That's how it felt for me, like that Sasha finally understood why she was kind of pushing her away, or like where the anger was coming towards Sasha's own identity, and that it was really more about Beatrice's own struggle, which I think honestly is true a lot of the time when parents can't accept their kids. It might not be as direct as that, but like, it usually has more to do with them. I think it was like this very painful thing that happens to Beatrice that I don't think she ever really told anybody about. She kind of just decided to try to be a very devout Christian and like live her life a different way. And then all of a sudden she has, this daughter who's like reminding her of her past. And I think it brought up a lot for her. And yeah, I feel like it was the first time we see her like open up about what happened, even though she doesn't end up saying that very much about it. But
yeah, and readers, they'll sort of find out more about what that is. We don't want to give too much away, I don't think, but I kind of is there a way of healing through all this? But what does heal?
I mean, I think healing is like a whole process and journey, like I don't know if there's like one thing to help you heal, but I do think them trying to tell their stories through these other stories was their way of trying to heal. And also just being able to be there for each other. I think Sasha and Zora do that a lot, telling each other stories to help each other through something that was difficult. And I do think by the end they're more healed, but they still have like, ways to go.
Yeah, we spoke a lot about stories and what their roles and what purposes, and in your novel, they seem to conceal, disguise, hide the truth, for better, for worse. But this is a novel where, to me, it seems anyway, permission and boundaries are not always respected, sometimes abused in relationships and in history as well. This idea of something that's repeated quite a lot is this: let me tell you a story. Can't say, let me tell you a story, and it becomes something of a refrain through the novel. And it almost felt like it was a way of soliciting permission in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of first came out of like the narrator's voice. It just seemed like something she would say. And it's also just like, I feel like usually every storyteller has a refrain, whether it's like once upon a time or like whatever. Crick crack. So in this case, it's let me tell you a story.
So it's a direct invocation to the reader, isn't it? You're directly saying to.
Yeah, I wanted to be talking directly to the readers, and like kind of just this idea that the book is sort of alive and that the voice is in there, and that she's like demanding their attention, I guess.
It kind of opens up this kind of contract with the reader in a way, this kind of direct relationship, because you say at the start, I need you to save my life. You're sort of keeping me alive by reading this novel, this story. Soraya, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the human origins of Beatrice Porter and Other Essential Ghosts. It's out at the end of April from Serpent's Tail. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
My thanks once again to Soraya for joining me for today's episode, and of course, my thanks to you for listening as well. Next time, I'm going to be joined by Duncan Vice, and I'm talking to him about his new collection, published by Lolly